Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another Via Media conversation. We're an organization that is intending to inspire a curious and hopeful humanity. We're having conversations that matter, that are really critical and important. I want to take a quick moment to thank Spark.Church. Thank you so much for your partnership in this very important conversation. I'm so grateful for your help and assistance in all this. Tonight we have with us Mike Martin, the co-author of Beating Guns, Hope for People Who Are Weary of Violence, co-authored with Shane Claiborne. For those of you who are watching live, please check out the Sli.do event number down below, 329-3502. We will be taking those questions later on in the evening. Mike, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We're so incredibly humbled and honored that you would join us this evening.
Thanks, Kevin. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Tonight's event is starting off on a sober note because we already have news. I mean, this particular subject is incredibly painful. It's heart-wrenching. I feel always at a loss for words whenever we come to this particular subject. So you're going to be my therapist in some particular ways and help us with some words and try to get our brains wrapped around this. But we're coming off of just the most recent of what seems to be a never-ending slew of shootings in America. So the University of Virginia, and our hearts are just, again, broken with that. And then just barely an hour ago, I got an email from a good friend who wrote that her niece lost her son to a shooting. And she writes in this email, "This senseless loss rests heavily on my heart, especially on heels of our discussion last week and ahead of tonight's session on beating guns. This increases my resolve to be involved in ongoing discussions and actions toward increasing awareness and driving change. Thank you for being a place and voice shining light in dark places." And I wanted to make sure that I said that to you, Mike. I feel like this book and the work that you're doing with Raw Tools is exactly that, a voice shining light in dark places. And so I want to extrapolate, I want to tear apart and learn as much as we can your history, the philosophy, the work that you're doing, the reasons why, and then how we can continue to advance this revolution of transforming this violence culture into a culture of peace. So let's start with a basic introduction. This was, I think, going to be helpful for some, I think, some of the religious aspects. What is a Mennonite, and how did a Mennonite become a blacksmith? Can you give us a very short history of your journey in your religious journey and then towards this work of Raw Tools? And then, of course, I should probably ask, what is Raw Tools and what is it that you do?
Sure, yeah. So my parents are Mennonite. I'm what people would call an ethnic Mennonite, their parents and their parents before them. But I actually grew up in an evangelical church for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
So my youth, my college, all in kind of a non-denominational space. And it wasn't until college that one of my professors encouraged me to kind of dig into my Anabaptist roots and see if that's something I still identify with as I was moving towards graduation, might find a youth pastor job. So he kind of wanted to make sure I was checking all my boxes. And when I did that, I kind of rediscovered what I was born into. And it really motivated me towards leaning more into nonviolence, valuing service. I think a lot of our traditions of Christianity value service a lot, and then also kind of this idea of separation in church and state, almost with a heavy emphasis on separation. A lot of people think of Mennonite and hear Amish. They're very separatist. Mennonite's different, but we're both Anabaptists. So that's kind of a quick capsule there. I learned how to blacksmith because of Raw Tools. My dad and I learned together. He has a family business that had someone who would work on his equipment when it broke, who was a blacksmith. And we floated this idea of, hey, can we make a garden tool out of a gun barrel? And he was very anxious to teach us this trade of blacksmithing. And my dad and I are fairly handy, but even without that, it's a lot more accessible than people think, which we can talk about. We'll talk about that later, about its impact on the ministry. But once we realized we could make a gun into a garden tool and invite others in, it just kind of snowballed from there. And yeah, and raw tools, we turn guns into garden tools. Initiate kind of discussions around trying to imagine if you didn't have a gun, how would you handle situations? So, kind of nonviolence 101. We're really grounded in restorative justice and practices, de escalation, mediation skills, and pushing people into that. And then once we kind of break that space, we want to identify the systemic influences that kind of encourage us to use violence in certain situations. Um, and then also the systemic change that we can make to try and curb those influences. And eventually, I mean, the goal would be to eliminate that influence, that we
Yeah.
could create safe communities where violence isn't that kind of tempter that it is right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the holistic approach of what you're doing is just so unique. I mean, at least in the rhetoric that we see in the media and the news, especially left versus right and Republican versus Democrat, is all about legislation. But your approach is very holistic, like everything that you just mentioned, nonviolence training. You're also participating in worship or liturgical aspects. And this is, I think, let's get to the core of the philosophy of what drives you. On page 21, you write this incredible phrase: peace begins with the people. It is not politicians who lead the way to peace. It is the people of God who lead the politicians to peace. We will make violence extinct by refusing to kill. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to some of the other questions that I sent you, but what seems to be happening in your philosophy is that in a world that is so inundated with, guns don't kill people, people kill people, these phrases that are just kind of thrown around, and then we don't have a gun problem, we have a heart problem. It feels like you're doing a both and. You in this book, you have articulated the both and. Yes, we do have a gun problem, but we also have a heart problem, and it sounds like what Raw Tools is attempting to do both. Can you speak to kind of that philosophy of how both of those work out in the expressions of this work and ministry that you're doing?
Yeah, I think they're connected when you talk about a certain section of anthropology. That's kind of popular name would be cyborg anthropology. That if I'm not holding anything, I'm capable of certain things. But if I'm holding a cell phone, I'm capable of even more things. Or if I'm holding a
Mm,
pencil or pen. So naturally, if I'm holding a gun, both the gun and myself are capable of different things if we weren't connected, right?
mm,
Than if it was in a safe or somewhere else, hiding in my nightstand. So I think all of that, the material of the gun, but also the person who I am, I'm not a vacuum. So that gun exists in my hand in connection to everything I've experienced. So when you open and talk about the University of Virginia and the email you got, everything that we're talking about here is connected to someone who's listening that has a distance from a trauma or a connection to a trauma or or they've experienced it themselves. And the more that we do these events, inviting people into this process, the more we hear people say, I never realized that I'm a survivor of gun violence because, and they'll list off the event that they were either present for but didn't really know that they were affected at the level that they were. But then
mm,
also, as we get even more to the surface, we hear about the gun problem, heart problem, and we need both of those things. It's easy to kind of fall into this bumper sticker or Twitter space where you only get that limited amount of characters to talk about this. And this is one of those issues you really have to break down, get into the nuance, get into the context, and understand that gun violence in rural Oregon is different than gun violence in suburban Colorado,
mm.
is different than gun violence in urban New York City. So all of these different places have these factors, and we really need to listen to the people in those areas who've been affected by gun violence to help us lead the way forward. And it's very rarely that you hear someone say that that way forward is with a gun.
Mm. You mentioned that we, when we no longer train to annihilate fear, we train to face it. I agree that there's the cultural differences in the context are pretty nuanced depending upon the geography and the society, the socioeconomics of that. Fear seems to be a core central ethic, core central impulse of humanity, and sometimes an ethic that we leverage. Can you speak to what do you mean when you say trained to face fear?
I think it's that the training is kind of in the experience, and I'll use kind of when we're planning events, even this book tour, when people say that they want to host us, one of the first ever questions is, do you ever have a protest? Do you ever have,
Hmm.
kind of a bad actor from the community at these things? And that's speaking from that fear, and really kind of starting to shed doubt on whether this process should happen. But then, and that was even within myself. I mean, we had other people who had been in peace work for a long time in our city be kind of the filing agent address for the organization, because I had fear of people kind of coming to our door, my personal house, looking for to do something to us. I don't know. Now that I've done this more often, I'm less fearful about it, although that anxiety still hangs out every now and then. But I think it's about taking that next best step. And one church that worked with us a couple years ago, we had that dialogue. Do we have armed security present while we host an event that is trying to send the message that arms don't keep us safer? And what eventually happened was this event came to fruition, and it felt more like a high school car wash welcoming the community to get guns, because it was after a mass shooting in the community and they wanted to respond to that. But there was still this kind of fear that was holding back the ethos of what the event could be, and what kind of that mentality that everybody holds when they're at that event. So something that could have paralyzed this church kind of decided to go at it together with multiple people, their group of the church that they are, and be this corporate voice in their community that said, we're tired of this and we want to imagine a new way forward. And for them on that day, it was to have a buyback. And the pastor often says that every gun that came in, everybody who was there got a little taste of heaven. When
Hmm.
we chopped it up, people who've been affected by gun violence helped cut up the guns. She'd ring a bell every time a handgun came in. There were posters, people holding posters. People from the Colorado Poor People's Campaign who were trained mediators and de-escalators were present just in case something did happen. But it was such a beautiful space because that church decided to kind of face that fear or live into the life that they want to be a part of, despite what the world is telling them could possibly happen.
Yeah, that's such an incredibly brave thing to do, and brave and courageous being not kind of a posture, a chivalrous posture, but the willingness and the discipline to go to the other side of that. And that kind of training seems to be something that you can only get by going through that emotion of fear. You know.
Yeah, there's kind of this acceptance of a level of vulnerability that you have to be okay with. And I would also say that maybe not everybody in that church was ready for that, and that would be okay. We need to allow space for that too. That this church can move forward, or any church can move forward, or a people group can move forward, knowing that some of them are struggling and that there might be something behind that, a
Yeah.
legitimate trauma in the past that needs to be addressed and shared with community. So it isn't to say that just because you don't want to step into this scary space doesn't mean you aren't brave, but it is to say that let's hold our fear together and not
Mm.
feel like we're all doing this by ourselves, which is what the pull of the gun industry is that you need this to be the individual you need to be.
And we're going to get into that. I'm really looking forward to you helping us understand kind of the recent history of the gun industry, the business end of it, and how it has created this very culture. I want to, before we get there, just kind of ask you on a very practical level. Somebody spits back at you some sort of slogan or saying that is on a particular political angle. Guns don't kill people; people kill people. Or I don't care. I'm terrified right now. I need to arm myself. What is your practical approach in those particular conversations? I mean, you've been holding these kinds of training sessions and events all across the country. And I'm sure you run into people who are like, I'm still very much in disagreement with what you're trying to do here. I'm actually going to feel a lot better if I go out and purchase a gun and I continue to perpetuate kind of this culture and the existence of guns and stuff like that. What is your practical approach? Something that maybe we can take away because we're having these conversations as well.
Hmm. Yeah, I think as the practical approach, if it's someone I don't have a relationship with, I'm going to test and see if this is one that do I have space to maintain this relationship and go down this road with that person, or try and connect them to someone that we might have a mutual friend so that they can have that conversation if I don't feel. But from a practicality standpoint, I'm going to, approach this very slowly. We're going to be in relationship together. We're going to commit to this from both ends. And this just comes from kind of restorative practices or dialogue 101. If you're going to hold a talking circle to talk about something, there's no time limit to that. And so I would enter into these spaces, and this goes as practical as like, I'm going to post something about gun violence on my personal social media page today. I have to commit to moderating all the comments that are going to be coming in because, one, because it's connected to the work that I do, but two, even if I disagree with someone, someone is watching how we relate to each other in that space. They don't care about the data points that either side is putting out there, but they do care about how the space is being held. And I would say that's just as important as trying to come up with that perfect response phrase, right? So start from that listening space, ask people what has led them to believe what they believe, and then start looking at statistics or real world examples. And both people will probably be able to put some of that forth. Um, and once you kind of get past that to that space, I lean into my Christian faith and what I believe Jesus calls us to. And if this person is also a Christian, then we move into that kind of next level of dialogue and ask, is this what it looks like to follow Jesus? Did dying on the cross give us an example of what we like to say in the book too? Is we were taught not to kill for people, but to die for people, and that's the example that we see. So you can it pulls you away from kind of that bumper sticker conversation back and forth.
Yeah,
If you
yeah.
start going down that road, that's the first sign that it's not going to work. It's not a healthy space. You need to kind of reel yourself and each other back and say, maybe we need to do this over a meal because that'll slow a conversation down too.
Yeah, we're incredibly inspired by that particular approach. The tagline for VIA is to inspire a curious and hopeful humanity, and that what you've just said is an exemplification of that curiosity. If you're doing a lot of listening and trying to find out where somebody's coming from and doing some common ground. Before we get to the history, another question just came to mind, which is a footnote as you were talking about having those conversations over. I was asking you before we went live about compassion fatigue and trauma fatigue. Can you speak to the idea, the experience that many of us have in this work of just getting tired, wondering if we're ever going to make a difference? It was a very palpable frustration after Sandy Hook when our government and seemingly the entire nation had an incredible uproar, but nothing actually materialized. And these kinds of stories are happening, again and again and again. And you're in this work every day. So I was just wondering if we could put a footnote question on how to maintain a disciplined commitment to this work in light of constant frustration, constant, opposition, compassion fatigue, trauma fatigue, cynicism, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, one, I mean, hold on to the things that give you life because at the end of the day, we're trying to take and affect something that is taking life from our world, and to let that take control of our everyday is really hard when you get into that space. I mean, I felt that deeply after Uvalde and Buffalo. That it felt like it was those two back to back within a week or so of each other. I fell into that space, and so um, in that particular instance, it was an email from a survivor that we worked with who was just sending a random thank you about the work that we had done that helped that person. And that helped pull me out. And then I moved into one of in the pandemic, I got a kayak. And so I just would get out on the water, and that helped recenter me. So there's these horrible things that happen within our work, especially when they're deeply connected to the work, like another mass shooting.
Mm.
and it's great to remind ourselves of what gives us life.
Mm,
And sometimes that has to do with the work. Sometimes it's just me canceling meetings and staying in the shop and making tools out of guns. And as Reverend Sharon Risher, who lost her mother in the Charleston church shootings, says, to beat the hell out of the gun, that we have to push that hell away and make room for life in our community, in our life, in our 3 foot circle. Right? We
yeah.
often say, like, you can affect what the first degree of connection. So it might be people, it might be practices, but that's how I deal with that. And sometimes it's a lot in 1 month, and sometimes it's once a year, but it definitely pops up, and you're not really prepared for it. So it's good that to be not when you're not in that instance, to think of the things that you're going to do when it comes up. Not unlike preparing for active violence. It's not
Mm,
always going to be a shooter, but it might be another form of violence that you have to prepare for and build habits to help moderate and mediate that situation.
mm.
And sometimes it's with yourself.
I love the idea that the work of justice and putting the world right is can feel sometimes platformed upon opposition. We are trying to fight against this thing, but you've also articulated, remember the thing that you're also fighting for, not just the thing that you're fighting against. And yeah, life is the thing that we are fighting for. And I mean, for crying out loud, I'm using the fight analogy and verbiage and metaphor even when talking about this. So it's amazing how ingrained this is. So
Yeah,
um,
spiritual warfare.
yeah, exactly. I mean, we probably need to deconstruct the language.
Yeah.
We, I want to ask you about this history. You and Shane have written some incredible history here. On page 47, you talk about figures like Buffalo Bill, Billy the Kid, Belle Starr, and Calamity Jane became American legends and went from lowbrow fiction to highbrow historical fact. Truth was the first casualty of our romanticism with guns. And then you articulate some of this Wild West and kind of the glamour of the cowboy. What is the truth of this mythology, Mike?
Yeah, right after that, what you read, there's another quote that talks about another person said that more people died in the cinema on those Saturday matinees than they did in the actual Wild Wild West.
Mm,
Right? That we have these two truths that we kind of lean into. One is that everybody was the John Wayne character, that the cowboy was this virtuous male figure, white guy that was going in to save the expanding settlers and colonialists in the American West. When in reality, the cowboy was more kind of that drunk guy on the weekends involved in domestic violence. And that's not the story that we would ask. We have a heroic vision of the cowboy of the West, and that's almost antithetical to what the cowboy was in a historical space.
and what prompted that shift, and what was who or what capitalized on that imagery? And I'm kind of leading the question. We're talking
Yeah,
about the gun capitalists and the whole business culture. So speak to the development through some of that history. You talk about war and like Winchester and Colt really taking advantage of those opportunities, those cultural opportunities to make a buck. And you're actually incredibly generous, I felt anyway, to the gun manufacturers because you said, I mean, they weren't in it to for the production of killing people. They were in it to make money. So talk through a little bit of how this developed over time, and then what kind of shifts and changes in the industry created this gun culture that we have, which is, I think, really helpful for understanding why we even have this culture in the first place.
yeah. There was a big shift in the mid 1800s in this that kind of coincided with the international conflict and the development of the gun industry within the United States. And two of the people we talk about in the book, Samuel Colt and Eli Whitney. Most people know of Eli Whitney as the person who developed the cotton gin, but he also kind of developed the mechanized process of making individual gun parts instead of one solid piece that you might see in like an older rifle. And the combination of those led someone like Samuel Colt to go to the loser of whatever war America was fighting and said, "This is why you lost. America had this revolver, and you didn't. You only had, like a musket or even a multi-fire musket. There's different variations of that too that they were selling to the losers after they lost, and pretty compellingly, right? And even indigenous people talked of the revolver as the spirit gun because it was taking life at levels that only you can imagine would happen from that spiritual realm, right? That you would almost attach to things like a plague. This gun was having that effect on in the American West, and so well, all over America, American South too. And so it's that kind of combination of one, the development of automatic weapons or semi-automatic weapons, and the development of the American market when there wasn't a war on.
Hmm.
So the war initially funded the gun industry, right? You'd make dozens of hundreds of guns a month, but outside of war, you might make 2 dozen guns a month for Winchester. Like it was almost nothing. One person could do that in a week, and so they needed to find ways to fill their market, so they wouldn't have to shut down the gun lines and start making sewing machines or whatever else the other piece of machinery they were making. So they created the gun market of the U.S. and they did that by having some old advertisements, which Shane likes to make into signs now, cutting up old gun advertisements and creating faith, hope, love, peace out of them. But you would create these heroes of the West, right? Facing down the bear, facing down the Native American, facing
Hmm.
whatever that challenge was, and then they moved it to one of the bigger marketing campaigns in business history in the American in the last 200 years was the boy plan, where they targeted boys aged 10 to 16 and made rifles just for them.
Hmm.
And so it started to create this want for something instead of a need for something. It
Mm-hmm.
used to be a need and they turned it into a want. And so suddenly the civilian market was offsetting the war market. And then you get to 1900s and the modern firearm era begins.
Yeah, that's incredible. You quote Pamela Haig. Am I pronouncing her name correctly? Quoted a couple times in the book. What once was needed now had to be loved.
Hmm.
There is there's also an additional conflict that exists in this development too. I mean, that's just an incredible. Shoot, I got too many questions. One, how much responsibility slash weight do you give to the industry for creating the culture versus the culture creating the industry? Because I feel like right now where we sit, it is the culture and the industry are in bed together, and they're kind of, you know, in this very symbiotic relationship. But the way in which you describe it, it feels like there's a fair amount of weight given to the industry for the development of the culture. Is that a fair assessment of your analysis?
Yeah, I think so. Just because the dissemination of information at that time had to be industry centered,
Hmm.
right? This isn't something that you could just kind of manufacture from the grassroots. If you did, it might have looked similar to like the old school traveling church revivals, right? Where this was flooding magazines and newspapers with advertisements, putting it along different, general stores, those kinds of places. So it was definitely something that was manufactured from within the industry and put out there, especially when you see that change from need to want or need to love,
Mm-hmm.
as Pamela Haig says.
Yeah, yeah. The conflict that I read in your book was that there were some who were really concerned as to what this was actually going to do to the individual. Page 64, you write, some gun enthusiasts warned of the danger of firepower replacing bravery, even mocking some of the modern guns by use of which an infamous coward could kill someone with a random ball from whence no one knew where it was shot. That was pretty striking to me. I kind of have this sense that people who love guns are just, they're all in. But to know that there was controversy or concern, and in some ways that particular quote is in many ways prophetically analytical of what happens when you put a gun into your hands.
Hmm.
Can and you kind of touched on this earlier regarding fear and kind of the posture that we have. I mean, is there any more? Can you give us any more perspective on that critique and tension that exists and how that has manifested itself in the promulgation of all this weaponry that we now have?
Yeah, it's interesting that that plays both on this idea of developing something that creates distance between me and my, um, I guess, whoever disagrees with me or whoever I'm in conflict with. Right? That's what they're talking about. That I can fling that ball, that bullet, over a distance instead of meeting that person face to face. So in some ways, it's almost the opposite message that you get now from the gun industry, right? That this
Yeah,
makes you more of a man, where this person who's saying, like this gun enthusiast is saying, no, it makes you less of a
yeah,
man
yeah,
because you can't face your fears. You have to get rid of it by killing your fear or what you think is that fear.
yeah.
And it's really pretty cutting. It says a lot. And to me, it's the same conversation right now that people have around drone technology, especially when it's attached to the military warfare. So it's interesting to see that coming out then, but you just don't hear it anymore. It's something that has been drowned out, and a lot of that got drowned out in the 70s and 80s as you see the narrative of the NRA change.
Mm, yeah. Can you tease out that drone technology? I mean,
Yeah,
comment there.
yeah, I think you get to this place where you have created, especially when you're talking about military and international warfare, you have to convince the nation that you represent that you are doing something that is moral and just. So therefore, you have to dehumanize something else or someone else to make them a target that is worthy of this of a bomb or a bullet. And when we add a drone to that, you're further distancing those two people. You're taking the relationship or any idea of a possible relationship between myself and another individual who's a part of a nation that we're at war with, by introducing this technology that isn't taking anybody with it to perform this task. So it takes even another separation. Now it feels like you're not even pulling the trigger. You're pushing a button on this end somewhere, but you're
Right.
not pulling the trigger with that person in sight like you are in what this person is talking about.
I feel like this element of the conversation is so critically important from an anthropological sociological perspective. It's very Marshall McLuhan-esque that we make our tools and then our tools make us. Whatever
Hmm.
it is that we do, we produce, actually has a very significant psychological and social effect on who we are and how we see things. And yeah, these weapons create further distance, and that distance diminishes our connection and our humanism and our humanity in that relationship with others. Okay, so the gun industry captivates the moment. They're looking for a buck. They're not necessarily looking to create an industry of killing, but and it's really stunning to think about American industries going to the loser of American wars to sell more guns. That I mean, that's just kind of a stunning fact, I suppose. Develops a culture through the advertising, the mythology of all that, which means that the appeal to the Second Amendment was not a primary driver of the late 19th century, early 20th century development of this culture. True? Am I wrong? What's your analysis of the role of the Second Amendment in the rhetoric and in the ideology during this particular time? Because it certainly seems like a prominent argument and appeal in our current day. And then we'll get to what really is the Second Amendment and how should we think about it. So let's start with some of the history of the role that the Second Amendment played in that particular time.
Yeah, at that time it was usually meant for militia would have been a much more common way to understand the use of firearms your kind of individual need to own one as if you were a part of a larger group that was tasked with the defense of something. And usually you see that, especially in the development of what we see now as law enforcement and slave patrols. You see that even in the first court cases dealing with Second Amendment rights and who gets to own the gun when when people of color start owning firearms. The first Supreme Court case was basically deciding, do people of color get to do this? Um, and Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz has a great book about that. And and then you also see that when the Black Panthers come around too, right? That they're starting to have these patrols where they're basically legal observers with guns watching white cops pull over people of color and making sure that those police are abiding by the law and not doing anything.
Yeah.
And then then you start seeing things. Reagan would come out and say stuff about that. So you kind of see that throughout this history. But I think it's more of kind of like behind the curtain at first in some of this change in the 1800s, seeing this advertising. You aren't seeing advertisement that says the Second Amendment means that your 12-year-old should get a gun. You're seeing a 12-year-old want to be like the hero cowboy, right? That's what we see in those things. So it is more of a modern development, but it is behind some of the other marketing. It's just not as blatant as it is now.
Yeah. Okay. So over time, however, the Second Amendment becomes much more prominent in the rhetoric and in the argumentation. And then this was something that I thought was really critical because it was a Supreme Court case in 2008, right? District of Columbia versus Heller. The quote here is, "For 200 years, the courts interpreted the right to bear arms as a collective or state right. But in 2008, it became crystal clear in the District of Columbia versus Heller that the right to bear arms is an individual right, and states cannot block it." Can you tell us more about this shift? I mean, that's a significant. I mean, 2008. This is fairly late,
Yeah.
quote unquote, late in the game.
Yeah, it's also, I think it's important to see this as something that was happening in the similar time frame that corporations were also seen as individuals. So there's
Right.
this commodifying of individuals that's behind this, I believe. But what it's saying that it's trying to remove and let you talk about the Second Amendment from an individual space instead of that corporate malicious space. It wants to create that next level of that. Um, and also in that decision, like it's still saying that there are still limits within that, right? You still can't. It's been 14, 15 years since then. You can't own a grenade launcher or a rocket launcher or a fully automatic firearm. That's still not as loud. So there are limits on what individuals can own, and that is still up for debate, right? We're still having that conversation about assault rifles. Is this something? And that's a gray area too. It's not easy to define assault rifle. We can look at it and see what we think is an assault rifle, but that doesn't make it that. There's a lot of pieces behind that, that especially people who want to make that move need to educate ourselves on that. And so there's this. It's that layered decision, but it is another win for the gun market to say, see, this is your right to love this. If we want to go back to the previous conversation, so that's kind of defining that it's not just something you need for this corporate militia group that's in the protection of maybe community property, but it is also this individual right for you to do this on your own. It almost falls short of kind of that deputization that we see happening in the recent abortion laws, right? It's saying that you are your own deputy. That's another way for me to read this.
How much of the Supreme Court decision, I mean, it's supposed to be anti or non-politically or non-partisanly influenced, but I mean, you can imagine that the industry, the gun industry, would have been lobbying and pushing and all that kind of stuff. I mean, in your understanding of that particular development, how much of the industry is still at play in pushing forward and advancing kind of these evolving interpretations of these laws that we have?
Well, you can't disconnect them. It's entirely connected. Almost all funded through NRA lobbyists, likely written by them as well. And you cannot disconnect it.
Yeah.
It's not possible. To say otherwise is to just claim ignorance, in my view. That those two go hand in hand.
Yeah.
And it's part of why we ground so much of what we do in the church, that we're a part of something else that gets to have a different narrative.
Okay, so let's talk about that, because this seems to be a core and central aspect of the work that you do and the philosophical approach going back to the very beginning, where not going to do this just through politicians and through, mandates upon our legislation and our laws. We're going to do this through the hearts of people. On page 182, you write this amazing line. I love it. Just as there is a spiritual dimension to our adoration of guns that is a form of idolatry, there is also a spiritual side to violence and our obsession with it. We want to suggest that it is literally a form of demonic possession. Period. Hang with us. Period. I really appreciated that. Hang with us. So explain your understanding / interpretation / provocation advocacy of demonic possession being an aspect of this adoration of guns and the spirit of violence.
Yeah, I think I'll approach it this way in language that I've used a lot more since we've written the book that's not in the book, that I don't think we think enough about what it means to pull the trigger when our gun is pointed at someone else. We put so much heavy weight on the what if questions that we're always asked. What if you walk in and someone's doing something horrible to your wife? Why wouldn't you use a gun to shoot that person? Why wouldn't you do whatever it is? And we can save kind of like the spectrum of what pacifism and nonviolence is. That's probably for another day. But we're sticking with gun ownership here. And when we put ourselves in the worst of the worst situation, instead of imagining how it got to that situation in the first place. What are we doing along the way, building habits of community and neighborliness so that we get to meet each other with open arms instead of bearing arms? That's how do we reimagine what that road looks like. And when we are beat over the head constantly with this, a good guy with a gun is the only thing that can stop a bad person, I would say, not just a bad person with a gun. I think that goes beyond just gun versus gun, that it's a bad person doing a bad thing to someone that you love. The gun is the easy option. And once we have that gun on our hip or in our nightstand, part of our brain, our imagination stops thinking of different ways to deal with that because we feel we already have that solution. And in that way, it's that possession, right? It starts taking over your imagination. It starts taking over how you develop your habits, how you discipline yourself to be, especially in our case, a follower of Jesus. And in that way, it definitely possesses what you do. But then if you continue to choose to use a firearm and you use it and it kills somebody, even if it is legally justifiable by the laws of our land, we are not understanding the trauma that creates, not just for the family that lost someone, no matter how horrible the thing that they were doing was, but also for you still took someone's life, and we don't talk about that enough. And that trauma, even though you have your people, let's say you did stop that situation at hand, you're still within that cycle of violence. And that's the demonic possession that has you. When you're in that cycle of violence and you can't get out, you're possessed and you cannot escape. And so for me, it's the work of the church to come alongside people who are stuck in those cycles of violence, abuse, trauma, whatever it is, and to kind of put our hand in there and offer a way out. And for me, this process of turning swords into plowshares is one of those ways we start to connect with people and start to seeing those. And I would have never had language for this 10 years ago when we started. It's only in working with survivors and victims of gun violence that they have helped inform me of what helps them in this trauma to continue talking about the loss of their loved one, keeps them alive. Not one of the people who took them getting the death penalty. That does nothing for them. But continuing to talk about the virtues of the person they lost, how the life they brought continues to bring life to them and their community.
That was incredibly, wonderfully articulated and beautiful. Sam, let's go ahead and get some of those Sli.do questions up in the comments. So we'll get to those in a second. I got a couple more questions for Mike, and then we'll head to the Sli.do questions. What you just articulated is not just about certain people, but is also about us. There's a part of what you just said that demands that we kind of take stock of our own hearts in many ways, right? And this kind of speaks to you mentioned the third way of Jesus in there, which is Walter Wink's wonderful phrase for a different way. And I was wondering how much of that. I mean, it's not just, I guess, for those of us who are on a certain path of trying to reduce gun violence, have a particular political and philosophical ideology. Some of what you said requires self-reflection as well. And I was just kind of curious if you could speak to that, because everything that you just said, I mean, that's within us as well. What could possibly possess us?
Yeah, the first part, our mission statement is to disarm hearts, forge peace, and cultivate justice. And disarm hearts was important for us to have first. That we do have to take stock. I often say I don't trust a pacifist who says that they would never kill somebody, because they aren't
Mm,
being honest with what they're capable of. They may be the best disciplined and have the best habits, and they likely will never kill someone. But if you can't get past that awareness of what we're capable of, then it's hard for me to work alongside you, because it's hard for me to believe the depth of the rest of your work.
yeah.
Um, and that's part of it, is that we have to understand that when we're putting in a situation where we might have lost a job, maybe a marriage or another significant relationship, and then a situation happens where all of our buttons are pushed, it's any one of us can quote unquote lose it, right? We can get more physical or more verbal than we would have ever been in any other kind of state, right? Even if we get to sleep for the night, we would wake up and not respond the way we did. And so it's so important for us to understand what we're capable of, not just the bad but also the good. And I think, going back to thinking about compassion fatigue at the beginning, that can start to infiltrate just how we act in the little things.
Yeah.
So yeah, remembering both what the worst of what we're capable of and the best of what we're capable of. But that third way isn't the middle, right? It's not these two extremes and you have to find the middle. It's a different way of looking at the situation
Mm,
altogether.
mm-hmm. Yeah. The other thing that you said that I thought was incredibly wonderful and profound is the word imagination, because that's the other piece of hope, is that it's not just optimism, feeling good about the future. It's imagining, conceiving. This is Walter Brueggemann's idea of the prophetic vision as well, of imagining a future and then working towards that. Oh, well, see, there you go.
I
Well,
already have a quote for this.
oh, right, where you go. So let's finish this segment on imagination. Then I'll get to the Sli.do questions that were submitted. Page 261. The more we surround ourselves with plows, the more we will find ourselves creating life. The more we produce with plows, the more we see others as recipients of that sometimes actual produce. The more we surround ourselves with guns, the more we will see people, animals, and things as targets. Our imaginations work with the tools we have. What a wonderful quote. So, share a little bit more about that idea and why and how imagination is so critical to the work that you do.
Yeah, I'm going to read this quote directly from Brueggemann from the Prophetic Imagination, because I don't have a genesis for the start of Raw Tools, but this is a quote that helped me take the next step to say, yeah, we can kind of start living into this. He says we need to ask not whether it's realistic or practical or viable, but whether it's imaginable. We need to ask if our consciousness and imagination have been so assaulted and co-opted by the American consciousness that we have been robbed of the courage or power to think an alternative thought. And that's to what I was saying earlier. Like, if we have that gun on our hip, it's hard for us to think of that alternative thought. And he says royal consciousness in the book, not American consciousness. So that's just an update to our context, that we are pulled kind of into this dominating empirical narrative of the day and saying that this is what we need to do to survive, where God and Jesus and the church as a collective have the power to pull us out of those self-deprecating cycles like violence.
Yeah.
And one of the best things about building like a blacksmith network across the country and volunteers who help disable guns is their ability to imagine a new thing to make out of the guns. I love our monthly blacksmith meetings where we say, hey, what are you doing? Or what can you do with this piece of the gun? We haven't figured out what to do with this yet. And another blacksmith says, hey, that looks like what I used to make this coat hanger. You could
Mm.
make that with it. And we continue to find new things beyond just garden tools and jewelry and what we say other lovely things in the book, that it's you can make anything you want out of the remnants of broken guns, and you can involve the community in that space too. You can have survivors help cut them up. You can have survivors help reshape them. You can have the community be a part of that as well. You can have them witness. You can create safe spaces for survivors to be witness to their community on the trauma and violence, the cycles that they're begging us not to continue to fall into.
Yeah. So good. Um, One of the questions that came in from Anonymous: if there is someone who is not religious, how would you connect them to encourage a nonviolence as a way forward? Is religion necessary as a common ground?
It's definitely not necessary. We do a lot of, I guess you could say, corporate or secular events where we invite, and you can have, um, when you involve the survivors, their stories often speak for themselves. So that's the context that I'm often find myself having these conversations. So I'm actually less and less in, I guess, what you would call normal places where you have these conversations, because I'm already in a context of gun violence. Um, but there are great statistics out there. One I often move towards is that a gun in your home is at minimum 3 times more likely to be used against you or someone you love than against an intruder. So ask in those conversations, like, ask them, how likely is it are you to be home? Even one, how likely is someone to even break into your house? But on top of that, how likely is it that you're to be home? That's against kind of the narrative of an intruder. You don't want to be there when people are home. So those chances already go down. But then also speaking to people who have used firearms, whether they be military veterans or law enforcement who have been disaffected or have regretted having to even pull their firearm, whether they use the trigger or not. Those stories work really well too. We often work with stories of people who have caused harm. They might be in prison, they might be out, and they talk about the effect that it had on their lives for pulling the trigger. So trying to stay informed around the trauma aspect of this from all perspectives, but also leaning into the data context that is your community. Maybe it's suicide, maybe it's domestic violence, each one of our communities. So find out what that data is in your community and use that in your relational dialogue.
Yeah, that's really good. Um, Bob writes, U.S. gun advocates, when faced with positive examples from other countries of legislation, say they need guns to resist government tyranny. How do you respond?
I'd like to see their example of when we've needed that. We live in at the same time, though, that narrative often comes from people who say that this is the freest country in the world. We can do so much without needing to get to the level of violence to buy our house, to drive our cars, to get to work, to ride the bus. We don't need to carry a gun to do any of those things. And in fact, more than 60% of our country do not own guns. A very small percentage of gun owners own almost half of our firearms. So most of us in this country already do life without firearms, and a large percentage of them um, don't even want to kind of bring that firearm into their life.
Yeah.
So
Well,
um,
well, the rebuttal, I can imagine, and I think I've heard this before, is Civil War, Revolutionary War. These are kind of prime examples in American history where violence was, quote unquote, necessary or at least utilized in the liberation of the American state. So, how would you respond to that particular rebuttal?
if I'm in a faith space, I lean into our history of being in diaspora and exile, and that God still preserves us as a collective. Don't allow that conversation to get to the individual, because that's not what this is about. This is about our collective survival and health as a community. And so it's easy to get pulled into that individual space. What are you going to do if the government comes to your door? Um, and it's really less doesn't happen much in that kind of community dialogue, that using that communal language. So at the end of it, for me personally, I'm not gonna kill for someone, but I'll die for someone. And if that is, then I choose uh, my death over someone else's life, if that makes sense.
We had a little bit of an internet interruption. You said, I'm not going to kill for somebody, I'm going to die for somebody. And then we lost you for about 5 seconds there. Could you repeat what you mentioned?
Yeah, and
Apologize.
so connecting that, if we do that as a collective, if we're not just
Mm,
out there individually dying, but we're saying as groups that we are not going to do this. I mean, the Mennonites, my faith tradition, have a history of conscientious objection to war, which is
mm,
connected to this kind of like international conflict or even regional conflict if we're talking about civil war, that large groups of people against other large groups of people, that says this is not the way forward. And so this is leaning into, this is probably something we need to cultivate more of, is how we look at collective nonviolence and how it works. There's a lot of great books out there that talk more about this. Ron Sider does a lot there about how nonviolence works. That nonviolence in international conflicts has a longer lasting effect of positive change than
mm,
violent conflict like a revolutionary war or civil war. I think we're still living in the violence of the Civil War when we're
mm.
talking about this today, as it with the Black Lives Matter movement and indigenous lives and how they're deeply undervalued. I don't think that that's something that is just 200 years ago. That's something we're still living today, and we're still in that cycle of violence. So I don't. Violence hasn't solved that problem like we think it did when the Civil War ended.
Man, that's so good. Two last questions, and then we'll let you go. What are some ways in which? Well, first of all, are you coming to California anytime soon? Is that on the docket?
Possibly. Southern California might be on the docket in the new year. That's still penciled in. It's not finalized. But other than that, right now we are starting to plan out our 2023.
Well, if there are any other churches or organizations, institutions in Northern California that would love to partner with Spark, I think, and via media, we would probably be very interested in captivating your travels out here, because I think, in addition to the work that you're doing, it's kind of the experience and the training that you also provide when you do those activities that I think is incredibly formative for the shaping of our minds and our philosophies, our spiritualities. Is there any way that our audience can support, other than buying the book, other ways that you need support or help in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, you can go to rawtools.org. You can buy the book along with the items that we make. The best way to know when tools are for sale is to subscribe to our newsletter at rawtools.org. We release them in batches, and they're often sold out within hours. So if you want to get in on that, get to the newsletter. But even more so, be open about talking about this in your community, whether it directly affects raw tools or not. I don't care as much about that. I want to get people active in talking about this. There's some resources we've made. A loaded conversation with Mennonite Central Committee is just a helpful dialogue guide to hold these conversations in your church. And then another one, if you want to create a nonviolent plan, a practice or policy within your church, Fear Not is a curriculum that just came out this year to talk about how to respond to active violence in your congregation. It's not always going to be a shooter.
Yeah. Pastor Danielle, push hell away. Yes. Stacy, we're still living through the violence of the Civil War. Wow. Yeah. This has been incredible, Mike. So many. We didn't even get to everything that you mentioned in the book that is just so helpful and insightful. You are a Mennonite pastor slash Amish pastor slash
No,
no
no.
Mennon.
Maybe
Yeah,
I need to cut this to get that myth gone.
that's right. Um, there are people in our church, in our audience, in our communities that are very tired, um, weary of the violence. It was just painful as a church. I know you know this. I'm preaching to the choir. To go through year after year after year of needing to pause for a moment because of another shooting, because of another act of violence, and it's just been weary. As a pastor, I'd love for you to close us, if you would be so kind, maybe with a short pastoral word of encouragement, of hope, of inspiration, imagination to our audience, from a profound place of authority, meaning somebody who lives this, walks this, and has trudged through the dark places. And we'll let you close us with that word, if you'd be so kind.
Yeah, Lord, thanks for this time together. I pray that you help us understand who we are. Help us to empower us to break the soil that we feel might be uh, corrupted, that we feel might be something we continue to walk over and not notice what grows there. We ask that you give us the tools to break that soil, to bring new life. We understand that we are in this for the reconciliation of all things, and that we want to follow you on that path, and we want to use the tools that you showed us to use to do this, that we don't exploit others, that we move forward with life at the center, and with our arms held together, that we do this in embrace of each other.
Mm.
In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Friends, thank you for joining us. The book, Beating Guns, Hope for People Who Are Weary of Violence, the organization, Raw Tools. Mike Martin, thank you so much, not only for your time, but for your work and for the inspiration and the imagination that you're giving to all of us. We so appreciate it, and we just wish you all the very best. We are hopeful for some California visit, potentially. May your tribe increase and continue. I am very hesitant and sad to say that this will continue, unfortunately. We still live in a very lengthy, strong, robust gun culture, violence culture, but people like you and the work that you're doing is advancing a pretty profound, radical, revolutionary change for which we are tremendously, tremendously grateful. So thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks, everyone, for having us and being a part of this conversation. It was a great joy to be a part of, and hopefully we cross paths with many of you in the future here.
Yes, that would be wonderful. Thank you again, everybody. Have a wonderful night, and we'll see you next time for our next conversation.